Well, I think Nine Inch Nails have the potential to be one of the biggest rock acts in the world, and they have a live show which is second to none.
Over here, the term industrial is kind of slapped on anything that's synth or drum machine oriented that's not a house track.
Oh yes, the 1980s. Often seen and cited as the pinnacle of the music industry. At least if boomers are to be believed. While most decades can really be defined by a handful of musical scenes or figures, the 80s does actually live up to its hype due to just how many genres that are defined by it. When you look at the 60s or 70s, there's a handful that come to mind, but when it comes to the 80s, you have new wave, hair metal, thrash, American brand city pop, proto Lady Gaga, hippie nostalgia, that classic hippity hop you can't stop, and Michael Jackson. And that's without getting into the popular and thriving genres that existed in the underground at that time, such as hardcore, the early noise scene, and, as pertains to our subject matter today, industrial. The decade defined by hairspray, nose candy, and decadence was almost inevitably going to breed some genres defined by the opposition to good times and the never-ending party. And industrial was one of the biggest in this category, having its origins birthed in the 70s only to be taken into a bold new direction by a handful of 80s groups who would fuse it with elements of new wave, metal, and punk and broadcast it to a broader and younger audience. Bands like Skinny Puppy and KMFDM were infamous in the underground for this very reason, putting out not only some of the most forward-thinking music of the time, but music that was heavier and more intense than much of what can be heard outside of the growing thrash scene of that era. And this wouldn't just be the case for underground acts. Even bigger, more mainstream artists known for pop songs, such as Depeche Mode, would begin to delve into darker, more industrial-inspired directions, even if they were to much lesser extent than others. But come the end of the decade, when you would think this bubble would pop, a band who would come to be the biggest name associated with industrial would be born. And that band would be none other than Nine Inch Nails. Love or hate them, Nine Inch Nails is a band that not only helped cap off the end of the 80s, but in many ways served as one of the defining acts in ushering in the 90s, with their output of that decade being some of its most defining music. But it all started with one unlikely artist and one unlikely record. Pretty Hate Machine was just an odd and unassuming album upon its release, with its legacy and sound still being a bit of a black sheep. While hardcore fans obviously adore this record, and its status as a classic is set in stone, it's pretty easy to see why it has such a mixed reception. Much like Marilyn Manson's debut, Portrait of an American Family, it would harbor a sound that would seem alien when approaching it in hindsight, as it's far different from anything we would hear from any of the band's future work. But buried underneath it all lies the heart and soul that defines the core sound and spirit of the band. The story of Nine Inch Nails is really just the story of Trent Reznor. So before we go any further, maybe we should start from the beginning. So without further ado, let's talk about the birth of Nine Inch Nails.
guys got a lot of airplay on that. How tough is it to get airplay on a record around here?
Well, it was pretty easy for us. The record was good enough, and the radio stations thought it was good enough, so they supported us.
Excellent, excellent record. Why don't you introduce the rest of the guys?
Okay, on bass guitar over here, we have Greg Thomas. On the drums, Ron Massara. On keyboards, Trent Reznors. And on guitar, Tim Kirker. My name's Scott Hansen.
And I'm going to throw in a plug for Trent back there, because when we did our feature, Scott's Kids, Trent helped out and showed a nice young man some synthesizers and all that sort of stuff, too.
Both Trent's origins as a person and a musician are fairly interesting. Just keep in mind that the same guy who wrote and sang this also wrote and sang this. While Nine Inch Nails got its start in America's pit of misery, Cleveland, Ohio, Trent himself was actually born in runner-up for rural shithole, Pennsylvania. More specifically, Newcastle. His upbringing would be a sheltered one, but not without any hang-ups. As an absolute surprise to no one, Trent is a child of divorce, and due to his parents' separation, would end up living with and being raised by his grandparents. Taking to music at an early age, Trent would begin to play the piano at a mere 5 years old, and for the most part have a more typical life. His grandfather would actually have many nice things to say about him, being both musically gifted and a well-mannered Boy Scout, though Trent would suffer childhood struggles all too familiar to those in similar situations.
To get my story, you have to understand where I came from, which is rural Pennsylvania in the middle of nowhere, in a time long before the internet, outside the realm of college radio.
And that would be the soul-draining isolation of living in the Midwest, something he mentioned in a 1994 interview. Reznor has repeatedly acknowledged that his sheltered life in Pennsylvania left him feeling somewhat isolated from the outside world. In a 1994 interview with Rolling Stone, he makes reference to his choices in the music industry. "I don't know why I want to do these things," Reznor says, "other than my desire to escape from small-town USA, to dismiss the boundaries and to explore. It isn't a bad place where I grew up, but there was nothing going on but the cornfields. My life experience came from watching movies, watching TV and reading books and looking at magazines. And when your fucking culture comes from watching TV every day, you're bombarded with images of things that seem cool, places that seem interesting, people who have jobs and careers and opportunities. None of that happened where I was. You're almost taught to realize it's not for you." However, Reznor later confesses, "I don't want to give the impression it was a miserable childhood." I mentioned this in my Bullets video, but the point still stands here. When you grow up in a rural or even dangerous place that doesn't really allow for much contact with the outside world, it leads to an upbringing of being sheltered and isolated, where you either develop big dreams or you fall heavily into a hobby, or more or less just get addicted to meth. Hence why Nowheresville, USA tends to be the origin point to many different bands. As for the case of Reznor, he would entrench himself into music and drama, participating in both band and school plays, the fruits of which we obviously saw play out not only with his later work in music itself, but even the elaborate and theatrical videos that he would create. In high school, Trent would learn the tuba, saxophone, and at some point the guitar, but what was most important was when he finally got his hands on a synthesizer.
The dream back then, because I grew up in a modest family, I wanted to get a synthesizer. That seemed like the perfect marriage of my interests, which was music, keyboards, but also electronics and what was happening in the primitive world of computers. And the first synth I ever got, and that was the greatest day of my life at the time, was the Moog Prodigy. It was pretty new. There was a music store in Youngstown, Ohio, New York Music. And through begging and chore doing, my grandparents bought that synth for me. And that was really the huge turning point. You know, I knew that thing inside and out, and it just felt musical. You know, it didn't have anything to compare it to in the world of synths, but it was deeply satisfying. You know, and it felt like a musical instrument, not just a collection of circuitry in a box.
While the Moog Prodigy was far from the most acclaimed instrument the company ever produced, it was definitely a good one to start with. And fun fact, it's this synth where the band The Prodigy got its name. But as he said in the Moog interview, getting that synth would forever change the trajectory of Trent's life, as he would learn it inside and out, and later even got a job working at a music store just to get his hands on more.
And then I started working at that store with the main agenda of, you know, enduring showing this stuff to people all day so I could get it at cost and have access to it. And that was in the eras of the Kurzweil had just come out, and the E2 was out, and then the DX7 came out, and it changed everything. Suddenly now, those big, cool keyboards that felt like they were made as pieces of art to make sounds no one had ever heard before. It felt like mad scientists created them to make. It was an endless palette of stuff you could make. They were magical, for the most part. Now everything was aiming for $19.99 or lower price tag, and everything had to have a fucking piano sound, and everything, what's the bell sound? So, does it look like fucking bells?
This experience would also help Trent develop one of his most important philosophies regarding sound design, and that was his distaste for overrated preset machines with a desire to use gear that would allow him to experiment and create noises that were not possible with anything else. Though post-high school, Trent working at a music store and obsessed with synthesizers and musical experimentation wasn't exactly the end of the line before we got 9 Inch Nails. No, Trent still had a long way to go, and that's where we would begin to see his overshadowed origins. The man responsible for writing some of the most emotionally heavy and experimental music to ever reach top 40 radio was the same man getting up to some good old Billy Idol karaoke. Trent's musical origins are neck deep into synth pop and new wave, as he would leave Pennsylvania for Ohio to go to school and pursue music on the side, before just opting to say fuck it and jumping headfirst into music as a whole. His first 2 bands would be The Urge, the group he was with in the video of him performing Eyes Without a Face, and the other would be Option 30. The Urge was more or less an over-glorified cover band, where Option 30 was the first real attempt at a project doing their own thing.
That I don't care so, 'cause I hear it all the time, but they never let you know on the TV and the radio. Shut up, she was young, her heart was pure, but every night it's crap she got. Said the truth in the street, she got me rapping to the beat, and I knew that she was.
Option 30 was more or less a footnote in Nin lore because not only was Trent's time with them short, he was mostly just a dude behind the keyboard making beep boop noises. The band had some solid new wave music under its belt, but as is the theme with this era of Reznor's career, it was more or less just your run-of-the-mill new wave music of the early 80s. And despite this amazing album art, with a well-dressed and serious Reznor being the standout, he ended up having little input on the music, and come 1984, would just move on and once again resurrect and destroy The Urge. The next group worth mentioning would be The Innocent, or as they were called when he joined, Hot Rod Me. As you can hear, The Innocent was as painfully 80s as you can get. It really is just Back to the Future music in all honesty. And as you can expect from such an obscure band, Trent's time and input was also rather limited here, with him doing one mini tour with the band and leaving less than a year into his tenure with them. But this is where we actually get to the point in the story where he would join the most infamous and famous of his pre-Nine Inch Nails projects.
Finally, over the last 10 weeks, we've introduced you to many talented local musicians in our Cleveland Breakout Concert Series. This week's trio is no exception. On our final edition of the Breakout, our man on music, Dave Tarver, shows you how the Exotic Birds have made modern music very popular in this area.
The Exotic Birds is the band most often thought of when people reference New Wave Trent, as they were the project that he would be with the longest and see the most success with. And honestly, it's just kind of funny watching the videos of what can be best described as Walmart brand great value flock of seagulls with a young, smiley Trent just happy to be there in the background. While there is quite a bit to get into when it comes to the Exotic Birds, the important bits are that they got pretty close to breaking out with some TV slots and radio play. And this band in particular was extremely hook and groove oriented. And I think this is where the proving ground for Trent's more pop-focused songwriting would really be fostered, as through each era of Nine Inch Nails, even during their heaviest and noisiest, he always maintained a hook-oriented nature to many of his songs, and overall elements of groove and pop that persisted through even the noisiest bits, especially during the Pretty Hate Machine era, but hey, we'll get there in due time. The other important aspect at play here is that Exotic Birds was also where Trent would start working with some of the most important pieces of the Nine Inch Nails puzzle, and that would be the manager John Malum, who would later go on to work with him on Nothing Records and played a key role in the DVT feud, as well as Chris Verena, who Trent had become acquainted with years prior when Verena wanted to buy his Lindrum.
I was collecting drum machines and just any part-time job I would buy. So my keyboard player was friends with Trent, and he was like, I wanted to buy a Lindrum. And he's like, oh, I know a guy in Mercer selling a Lindrum. And I was like, no way, cool. So we drove down, I bought Trent's Lindrum off of him. And I'm still in high school. I mean, that's how he and I met.
Exotic Birds would be their first time having a real working relationship together musically. And when it comes to important collaborators and musicians in early NIN, while Danny Lohner and Robin Fink are important, Chris Verena would easily be the most important. After a couple years with the Exotic Birds, as was the theme here, Trent would eventually just grow tired of the project or feel constrained and leave to do bigger and better things. The last two projects that he would participate in would be Slam Bamboo and Lucky Pierre. But outside of Trent being a member, the only real thing of note here is that these bands would also bring more names into the mix that would later come to play with projects associated with Nine Inch Nails, such as Stabbing Westward, Prick, and even Filter. But it was after leaving a graveyard of synth-pop groups in the dirt that Trent would finally reach a point where he would give up the traditional band dream and use some of these opportunities and tools at his disposal to create a project all his own. As we covered, our robe-wearing Lord of Darkness and Depression originally got his start as a preppy keyboard player in God knows how many synth-pop groups. But after a damn near decade of coming close, yet never quite making it, Trent would finally opt to do things his own way. During the latter half of the 80s, Trent would end up getting a job at Right Track Music Studios, working as a glorified janitor where he would strike a deal with the owner that during studio downtime at night, he could use the equipment.
And I got a job in the studio doing the jobs nobody else wanted to do, from toilet cleaning to, just let's put it this way, bad stuff nobody wants to do.
Cleaning God knows what out of the bathroom floor and wiping up whatever drug residue is left in an 80s recording studio might not be the most glamorous thing to do, but it was what gave Trent the ability to economically learn and study production, as well as the freedom to work on his own music at his own pace in his own way. Something that we would come to know throughout the decades that Trent really needs in order to produce his best work. Now, something very important to note here was that during Trent's time as a new wave vagabond, he would end up being introduced to, at the time, up-and-coming artists such as Skinny Puppy and Ministry, and his friendship with Chris Verena only further fostering that newfound interest.
When I drove up from Cleveland from Kent State, which is about a 30-minute drive, to kind of audition for that Exotic Birds gig I just mentioned. But of course it was like I knew all the material, I knew the guys, and it was just kind of let's just see if it works, and it did. So they were going to go see this band called Skinny Puppy that night that Andy was into, and it was the Mind Perpetual Intercourse record, which I think was '86 that came out, and still one of my favorite Skinny Puppy. It had Dig It on it, and I mean, and Stairs and Flowers. I mean, to me it's still my quintessential Skinny Puppy record.
He would eventually meet and foster a friendship with Ministry, in particular Al Jorgensen, and would work on songs from various members of that band. And we would see these pop up here and there in the Nine Inch Nails catalog, such as the timeless classic Suck and the Queen cover Get Down, Make Love. And the Ministry connection doesn't stop there. He would even for a time work as a roadie for the band, with Al Jorgensen hilariously remembering, "Trent Reznor put up with a lot of abuse from us when he was our roadie. We started out with throwing firecrackers in his bunk on the tour bus. He was kind of grumpy about it, but he didn't freak out. Then I threw an M80 firework in there, and he went flying out of there half on fire. Later, I roofied him when we were in the studio and shaved his head while he was passed out. I was actually going to shave his eyebrows off as well, but he came to after, and I had only finished one eyebrow. He was kind of mad about that, but I have nothing but good things to say about Trent." Now, Uncle Al himself was someone who took a very similar journey as Trent, starting off his career producing new wave and synth pop, only to later embrace a darker, edgier sound bathed in noise and industrial, redefining his entire identity and impact on the music world. And this is something I can't help but think that Trent really saw within himself during his time working for Ministry. Now, the original demos produced for what would later come to be the Nine Inch Nails debut would be the elusive and infamous Purest Feeling. A noticeably more immature, softer, and dancier progenitor to the entire Nine Inch Nails sound. There's a prevalent feeling of insecurity and, for lack of a better term, innocence to a lot of what can be heard on Purest Feeling's work. It's kind of odd hearing Trent sing similarly to how he would on Pretty Hate Machine, all while he does it over some well-produced but admittedly cheesy synth-pop songs. I mean, just listen to how painfully 80s this gets. And it's not even that this is bad, not even by a long shot, it's actually pretty fantastic. Like I said, it's just very weird to hear this and know it's branded under the banner of Nine Inch Nails. But this was the beginning. Purest Feeling was the fruit of Trent's labor and what would lead him onto the path he needed to be on. What would be the biggest turning point, however, would be when he started to take some of these songs out on the road to gauge audience reaction and see how he could properly present the whole thing to the audience. There wasn't a real set of a live band just yet, just a revolving door of members, and, well, this is what Trent had to say.
This was the beginning of '88, and during the course of that year, the first 6 months of that year, kind of came up with the idea for Nine Inch Nails, and sent some tapes out, got a record deal, and by the end of that year, and then '89, I spent the first 3 or 4 months writing the record and then recording it, which takes us to summer. Then I got a band together to play out live, which takes us to late fall. Then we started playing out in January, and we've been playing out on the road since end of January until now.
But before we move on, what I do think is very interesting about this era of Purest Feeling is that it includes many demo versions of songs that would make the cut for Pretty Hate. Hence why I haven't really gone into it, because I don't really want to spoil what we're about to get into. But the one I will is the one that I think tells the most here, and that is this original version of Down In It.
Kinda like a cloud, I was up way up in the sky, and I was feeling some feelings you wouldn't believe. Sometimes I don't believe in myself, and I decided I was never coming down. Just then a tiny little dot caught my eye. It was just about too fun to see, but I watched it.
While many would just see this as maybe a boring scratch version, I think it shows how even during this time, the building blocks for what would later come to define not just Pretty Hate Machine, but even some of the songwriting techniques used on songs like Closer from Downward Spiral were already showing their face here. Part of what would make the core sound of both Purest Feeling and later Pretty Hate Machine was the more stripped down nature of its production, with the majority of the songs being composed and recorded with early tracker software and computers, and only the guitars and vocals and some of the brass instruments being left unquantized and human recorded. And even among its electronic production, there was only a small amount of instruments available to be used. The majority of the record being done with a single drum machine, sampler, and just a couple of synthesizers, resulting in a limited but unifying sound across the songs. These demos would end up being shopped around by Exotic Birds manager John Malm, and after a handful of smaller labels would show interest, Trent would opt to go with TVT Records, an at the time niche label defined by their output of television jingles and soundtracks, who was just starting to try and take steps into the world of commercial music. While in hindsight, signing with TVT was a big mistake, due to just how sour that relationship between Trent and the founder, Steve Gottlieb, would really get, and how far Steve would end up going in attempting to sink the career of Nine Inch Nails. Hell, even over a decade later, Lil Jon of all people would experience some similar issues.
Steve Gottlieb's business practices killed that label. You know what I mean? Not taking care of his artists.
How so?
Like, just not taking care of his artists. He didn't take care of his artists. You know, I don't like to get into all that shit because I'm a very positive motherfucker. I don't like to dwell on any negativity. I like to keep everything positive, find the positivity out of a situation and take that and move on. But it was just he just didn't take care of his people, basically, bottom line. He didn't take care of his people, and he didn't really show a certain amount of respect for his artists in the end of the day. He didn't show them that he appreciated them taking his label from here to here.
But at the time, TVT had the resources to get big name producers and put records out across the country, and that was an opportunity that just couldn't be missed.
Nine Inch Nails are one of the more accessible bands in this new wave, with their use of pop form and melody distinguishing them from the driller-killer Boys Noise Brigade. But like other bands in the movement, they do seem unhealthily preoccupied with boredom and apathy.
Upon signing a deal with the Devil, aka Steve Gottlieb, Trent would get the funding and support necessary to create the album that he desired, even getting multiple high-profile producers to work on the record, including Keith LeBlanc, Adrian Sherwood, John Fryer, but most importantly, Flood, the man responsible for producing some of Depeche Mode's most defining work. Trent would assemble the core of what would become his live band during this time and create a far more unique look and aesthetic to define them. Chris Vrenna and Richard Patrick in particular would be featured, both members of previous groups he played with, such as Lucky Pierre and Exotic Birds. The aesthetic that the band chose would be best described as Mad Max New Wave. While we can still laugh about how 80s this still looked, it's honestly a fun and interesting aesthetic, and in many ways a breath of fresh air from the over-colorful and flamboyance of many similar acts of the time, without also falling into the pit of just looking as goth and monochromatic as possible. The 80s really was the era of individuality taken to such an extreme that everything becomes indistinguishable. Now, as for the album art, Pretty Hate Machine has a very odd piece of art representing it, but it's become iconic since. It's actually an obscured, warped picture of turbine blades coated in these vibrant blues and pinks. Apparently it was meant to look like a ribcage, but I'm not even gonna lie, I always thought this was just some odd picture of a microphone that was kind of warped. Though that might be because the remastered version lacks the color and looks even closer to an old microphone, but regardless, the art does a great job of matching the look and feel of the band's aesthetic, and was very alluring to a new audience at the time. Now, the reason I'm focusing on the aesthetics here is because it really did a lot to match the contents of the music. Pretty Hate Machine really took the synth-pop bones with the occasional flashes and flares of industrial that were sprinkled in, and blends them into a much more cohesive sound. I honestly have a really hard time describing it because it's not exactly industrial, but it's too dark and too aggressive to really be new wave either. And the consistent use of distorted guitars only obfuscates whatever pigeonhole you could put this record in even more. So instead of trying to describe it to you and find a way of categorizing it, why don't we just cut to the chase and already just dig into what Pretty Hate Machine really is. The album starts off with its most iconic and well-known song, Head Like a Hole. This track would be the lead single that most people would first associate Nine Inch Nails with, and is more than likely what got the album itself labeled as industrial. That's not to say there isn't more of that to be found later into the album, but this song sounds like a commercialized and far more rock-oriented form of what many of the industrial bands at the time were doing. It's got the vocal samples, distorted synths, high-gain guitars, screaming about capitalism or whatever the fuck this song is actually trying to be about. It hits all the right notes, and just to cut this before it even happens, before you start screeching at me about the really deep meaning of this song and how it fits whatever political ideology you have, or whatever crap you're gonna come up with on Reddit to then post in my comments, why don't we take a look at a quote from the man who wrote it? I don't remember what I was thinking about at the time, but it was pretty much yelling at a beast without putting a face to it. Now, that being said, I don't bring up the vaguity of this song just to take a shit on it. I actually love Head Like a Hole, and I think its lyrics are very fun, and they're a big reason why it got popular. But the vagueness works in a pop and radio sense, as anyone who's sick of whatever machine they're stuck in, whether it's work, the government, or your parents forcing you to eat your fucking vegetables, it fits the bill for anyone who wants to scream about a power structure that they don't want to bow down to. And despite my jokes, it's a powerful one that anyone could relate to. The catchy progression of the song with a chorus that sounds as powerful and energetic as it does just shows how talented of a songwriter Trent was, even at this early juncture, knowing what elements were perfectly good to put together to create a possible anthem for a decade that hadn't even started yet. Head Like a Hole's follow-up also keeps up this energy of industrial rock, with a big catchy hook, heavy distorted guitars, and synths that wouldn't sound out of place on a Depeche Mode record.
I think you owe me a great big apology. Tell a lie! Tell a lie! Tell a lie!
And unlike its predecessor, Terrible Lie is very obvious with its meaning and its lyrics. Hey God, I really don't know what you mean. It seems like salvation comes only in our dreams. I feel my hatred grow all the more extreme. Hey God, can this world really be as sad as it seems? Raging Against God was not an uncommon lyrical theme in the underground music scene during this time, but hearing it done in a much more palatable way with a verse even hinting at Trent's desire to not let go of his faith, well, it made the idea much more relatable and real than just a religion sucks or I hate God approach, as even those who still held their belief can relate to the frustration of living a hard life and struggling to maintain their faith in what they see as a close comfort. And that's just speaking on the lyrics. The song itself is also just fantastic and only further blends the industrial synth-pop hybrid sound that the band kind of existed in, which is the major strength of the record. It's kind of, again, not to sound condescending here, but Baby's first industrial album. It's got enough rock elements to feel like something that a rock audience could listen to, while also having a synth-pop for the new wave fans to get into it, but being just noisy and heavy enough and unconventional enough for the industrial crowd to see it as something that's not too far away from what they could enjoy, and for many people who want to get into those records, having a much easier transition into it. Jumping headfirst into a record like Mine the Perpetual Intercourse or even The Land of Rape and Honey is very intense to go into because it's harsh, noisy, heavy, and more intense than most things you would probably listen to, whereas Pretty Hate Machine stands in a much more friendly and open way where it has those elements in it, but they are sparse enough and covered in enough hook-oriented material that your average normie could find something to enjoy with it. And track 3, while being infamous for some of its design choices, as we'll say, still continues this element. Look, I know Down In It is a song that some people really can't get over the fact that Trent does some pseudo white boy rap on, but Down In It is unironically my favorite track off the record. And that's because I think it's the quintessential Pretty Hate Machine song. It both sounds like a dated 80s track and a forward-thinking 90s song. It shows a ton of polish and foreshadows many of the future hallmarks of Trent's songwriting, while also indulging in very of-the-time songwriting choices. Also, its video is a lot of fun. It was the first real single that many people heard from the band when it dropped, so it has a very important role in Nine Inch Nails' lore as a whole, even if it does take very liberally from Skinny Puppy's Dig It. But alas, like many records of this era, the beginning is extremely strong, but once the center is reached, it gets a bit mixed. While Head Like a Hole, Terrible Lie, and Down In It have all been remembered as timeless classics, there's a reason why track 4, Sanctified, is not so much. And that's because it's even cheesier than Down In It. Sanctified is a sleazy piece of dark new wave, with a catchy but dated bass line and lyrics that turn what could have been a much better song into something that's honestly a bit cringy. Heaven's just a rumor she'll dispel. As she walks me through the nicest parts of hell, I still dream of lips I never should have kissed. Well, she knows exactly what I can't resist. These aren't even the worst lines the song has to offer, and this isn't a one-off situation either. As I kind of hinted at earlier, many of the songs contain immature and, well, amateur lyrics. And that's not to say that the lyrics are all bad. Again, some great songs like Sin, Terrible Lie, and Ring Finger are on display here. But the typical brutal honesty steeped in personality and powerful lines that Trent is known for is really only in its infancy on Pretty Hate Machine. So when he hits, he does hit hard, but when he misses, he really, really misses. That being said, Sanctified is followed up by what has stayed one of Trent's most beloved and relatable songs, even all these decades later, clearly showing off his true lyrical talents, and that would be Something I Can Never Have.
Gray would be the color if I had a heart. Come on, tell me you make this all go away. You make this all go.
In this place, it seems like such a shame. Though it all looks different now, I know it's still the same. Everywhere I look, you're all I see. Just a fading fucking reminder of who I used to be. Come on and tell me. Something I Can Never Had has stood the test of time because it's just a damn good song. It's emotional, relatable, and very well written. It's another one of the key moments on the record where we get to hear Trent show off a sound and song style that would in only a few short years become a staple of his work. But it's in its most raw and original form here. And if I'm honest, that's really the best part of Pretty Hate Machine as a whole. The jarring new wave past of Reznor and even the very far off sound this record holds compared to anything else that the band would release, especially the following EP and album. Sure, it's fun to hear these songs like Kinda I Want To that serve as that middle ground between synth-pop Trent and the industrial titan that we all know and love, but the true standouts here are tracks like Something I Can Never Have, Terrible Lie, and, well, Sin. Sin is another song up there as one of my favorites off the record, and given its popularity to this day, I'm far from the only one. It's fast-paced, catchy, and filled with amazing sound design and synth work, and the cherry on top is that it also has Trent's best vocal delivery on the entire record. Well, like much of the other work on this album, it does still sound very dated. Sin is probably the closest we're going to get to hearing the future of Nine Inch Nails here, and it's just such a groundbreaking piece of work that truly is that missing link between rock and industrial. It very much is something that you could hear in the realm of an artist like Skinny Puppy or Ministry doing, but with far more well-polished vocals and lyrics that are palatable to the radio audience and to a mass audience as a whole, all without sacrificing the atmosphere, the aesthetic, or the intensity that is required for an industrial track. And this is something mirrored with its follow-up, That's What I Get, which is still fast-paced and catchy, but eschews percussion work and caters itself more towards a new wave audience than Sin does, all again without sacrificing its core sound and embrace of that more industrial influence. While the song does negate percussion for the most part and relies more on atmosphere, which could be more boring to some people, its closer brings in that percussion and is truly a masterful ending. Now, to bring back Purest Feeling up again, The Only Time is actually a track that would sound much more at home on it, and is a very curveball song to be found here, but alas, it's infectiously catchy.
Something new.
Now, the last two songs off the record are Ring Finger, the album's actual endpoint, and the bonus track Get Down, Make Love. Ring Finger is a song where we get to hear Skinny Puppy's influence all over it. From the synth sounds, song structure, sampling, it's all just a love letter to Mind the Perpetual Intercourse, with Trent's own trademark sound gluing it all together. Ringfinger is also a stark contrast to most other closing tracks on Nine Inch Nails' catalog, as it's an upbeat banger of a song rather than a somber and quiet closer. And while it might be the ending of the record, the true ending that most people think of when the topic of Pretty Hate Machine comes up is Get Down, Make Love. This is that collaborative track between Trent and Al that I covered earlier. It's a classic Queen song that they transformed into a, as goofy as it is, absolute banger full of piss and vinegar that is a trademark of 80s industrial grit, with distorted vocals, screaming, and just good times to be had overall. While it's not as thematically pleasing of an ending song as Ringfinger is when it comes to capping off the record, it's a strong and powerful endpoint for the opening statement of the band's career, and is one of the most essential pieces to the puzzle that is Pretty Hate Machine.
Over here, the term industrial is kind of slapped on anything that's synth or drum machine oriented that's not a house track. And it's just more aggressive type stuff. Skinny Puppy, Ministry are like the leaders over here. And there's definite tip of the hat to those bands. I have respect for them and like them. Trying to kind of bastardize that genre a bit, bringing in some other elements that you normally don't see that much.
Pretty Hate Machine would end up being a sleeper hit, achieving moderate success and widespread critical acclaim. While it wouldn't be the career-defining piece that would land them in the history books like their second record would be, it was a fantastic start, and one that would see a massive payoff after years of failed new wave acts, grinding it out in the club scene, and cleaning cum off the floors of grungy studios. The tours that the band would join in order to support the record would be integral in landing the band the proper audience that they needed. Previously going out on stints with industrial acts like Skinny Puppy and Ministry, and post-record going out and supporting acts like Peter Murphy, shoegaze legends the Jesus and Mary Chain, and even a tour opening up for Guns N' Roses of all bands.
Now I heard you're actually going to open up for Guns N' Roses in Europe, is that right? How did that come about?
Well, Axl likes us, and we kind of made friends with him, and he said, would you get on the tour? So it'd be an experiment. Yeah.
The consistent crossover in different audiences and demographics for the band would really allow them to accrue an eclectic and diverse crowd of fans from all over the alternative music world. And with their, at the time, odd crossover style sound fusing many different genres into their own Frankenstein's monster, it did a lot to separate them from any niche that they would really be tried pigeonholed into. Though there was one label that they couldn't escape, and this would cause a bit of controversy around them.
That your place on this bill reflects maybe an increase in respectability for Nine Inch Nails in particular and industrial music in general. Do you think industrial is going to cross over into the mainstream?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that we're really an industrial band. We've been tagged as that, and I don't mind it, the tag that much, but if we are, we're on the outskirts of what would be, and I don't think we're classically called, we're not really a classical example of an industrial band by any means.
In an odd parallel to the many post-hardcore bands who would be tagged as emo during the 2000s, taking an at the time underground but very defined genre and using it to tag a new breed of artists and bands and forever changing the definition to anyone outside the cult fan base, outlets and retailers would begin to dub Nine Inch Nails as an industrial band. And while that previous clip shows that Trent was aware of how far from the traditional path of Throbbing Gristle or even the new wave of Skinny Puppy, it's safe to say that as the band progressed with future releases, they would, funny enough, transition in and out of being more directly part of the industrial pond. But this tag as industrial would not only be a foreshadowing of the band's future sound, but great marketing material for them to really describe their odd fusion of noise, synth pop, and rock with some traditional industrial elements that they were playing with during their early years, giving many outlets and magazines and new fans a buzzword to throw around that could really turn heads, as again, the average listener, at least by late 80s standards of radio, probably wasn't aware of artists like KMFDM or Ministry. Regardless, however, despite how good Nine Inch Nails actually was, due to the perceived misuse of the industrial tag on the band, there would be a small but loud minority denouncing the angry synth-pop group paraded as industrial. Serendipitously, this would also happen with Trent's future protege Marilyn Manson, as he would constantly be labeled as industrial when in reality he was just a hard rock artist who occasionally dipped into the noisier side of things, and had some industrial elements here and there, mostly due to Trent's influence during Manson's first few releases. But that's a story for another video. But speaking of Manson, this would be the time period in which he would become acquainted with his future father figure. Manson was a journalist at this time, and being an early fan of Nine Inch Nails, would score an interview with Trent, and not long after, they would become close friends and spark a working relationship. Though, despite the fact that that would be a relationship that would fizzle out into a feud of its own, it was far from the worst of the future turmoil that Trent had stumbled into during this era. The same label that helped give Nine Inch Nails a voice by putting their records out in stores quickly turned on Trent and began to act just as awful as the worst of the major labels. TVT Records smelled money all over the band, and with the critical acclaim and moderate success of Pretty Hate Machine, wanted to use their newfound cash cow to rake in even more profit, even after they had taken a massive shit all over Pretty Hate Machine in the past and mistreated Trent and abused him as an artist. And instead of seeing the unlikely success of an album that, I quote, was an abortion of a record, and saying sorry and maybe trying to mend that relationship and make it a bit more workable and amicable, label owner and founder Steve Gottlieb would just put more gas on the fire by restricting what Trent could and couldn't do with his music, and even when Pretty Hate Machine sold 1 million copies, he would react by condescendingly demanding that the follow-up sell 4 million. This tension would result in one of the most infamous and tumultuous artist-label feuds to ever happen, one which would resolve in one of the most defining works that the band would put out, as well as an experience that would forever change the way that Trent viewed labels, production, and even inspiring him to create Nothing Records. But, as I've said more than too many times at this point, that's a video for another day. And you know what? We'll talk about that very soon when we cover the controversial yet brilliant follow-up to Pretty Hate Machine, Broken. But with all that being said, I do want to introduce you to one more thing. This is my wall of shame. This list of rejects is my glorious support system in Hugbox, where instead of giving me emotional support in my times of need, they do the right thing and throw cash at me instead. All jokes aside, I can't really state how grateful I am for their support, and they're the ones that help keep this channel going. If you would like to show your own support, Patreon and Ko-fi links are in the description. But with all that, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, join the Discord server, and I'll see you in the next video.